In this video, we will show you how to replace your upper and lower ball joints on this Jeep Wrangler. This is part of your front suspension located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing that I want to mention is whenever you're doing one of these ball joints, it's a good idea to do the upper ball joint and the lower ball joint at the same exact time. With that said, let's safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground, remove all 5 of the 19mm lug nuts, and then the wheel. Now we'll continue on to removing our tie rod ends from the steering knuckle. Use a 21mm, remove the nut, and then remove the tie rod end from the knuckle. There's one. We've got that nice and loose. We'll pause on this one. Continue over here. Now we can lower this as needed. If you find it's hanging too low, you could use a bungee cord or a strap to hold it up. Now we can pivot this as needed. Let's continue on with removing the ABS wire from the bracket right up next to the knuckle, and then the mounting points where it comes across the flex hose. Just carefully pull that out of place. Now we can move along to our two 21mm bolts that hold our caliper bracket in place. Remove the bolt, give it a quick inspection, start it back in just a couple threads so we can remove the other one. Take hold of that caliper, give it a little wiggle, and remove it from the brake rotor. Now we're going to give this area a quick inspection. Checking out the pads, you want to make sure there's plenty of meat on these and they're not worn at a funny angle, and also double check to make sure there isn't any fluid coming along the seal area. This one looks fine, so we'll hang it aside, putting no pressure on the flex hose. Now we'll continue on to disconnecting the ABS wire along the forward bracket here. Continue along the backside. We're going to follow the ABS wire up the flex hose all the way up to its mounting point behind that front shock. Now we'll disconnect the ABS connector up in this area. There should be a red locking tab. Use a small pocket screwdriver to pull that away from the lock. Once you have that pulled down and away, squeeze on that locking tab and separate the two areas. Give them a quick check for corrosion. These look good. Take that ABS wire and start bringing it closer to the knuckle. We're going to tie it up so it does not get damaged in any way while we continue. Move along to your 36mm axle nut. We'll break the axle free from the wheel bearing using a punch and a hammer. Once we have that side broken free, we can move along the back side of the knuckle. You'll find that you have 3 13mm bolts holding this in place. You need to use a 12-point. Now that we got these two, let's go ahead and turn this knuckle and get the last one. Once you've inspected that bolt, go ahead and start it back in there, a few good threads. We'll put our socket on there, use a hammer. We're going to give this a couple light taps, trying to drive the bolt out through the knuckle, pushing the bearing out and away from the knuckle as well. Once you have some movement from that bearing, go ahead and remove that final bolt. Let's take that ABS wire. We're going to put it through this area behind the knuckle. I don't want to put a tug on that in any way. Now once again, we're going to tie this up and out of the way. We'll take hold of the wheel bearing and the backing plate and pull it right out of place. Go ahead and give that a quick inspection. Make sure it is reusable and it's not damaged in any way. Set it aside. Now we can start removing the axle from the differential tube. If you have a hard time pulling it out, you can carefully use a pry bar. Just don't hit up against this plastic protector. Right up here. Commonly, you will find that you have a shim on one end of the axle. You will want to reuse that. While you have the axle out of there, you want to inspect the U-joint on it. That's this area right here. Make sure it pivots freely and it doesn't bind in any way. If it feels like it's stuck and you really have to force it, there's an issue. With that axle out of the way, we can start removing our ball joint mounting nuts. The lower ball joint will have a cotter pin. We'll go ahead and take that right out of there, and then we can remove the nut. Once we have it out of there, go ahead and start it back on there, just a couple threads. We'll move up to the upper ball joint. Use 1 1/16 to remove the nut. Quick inspection. Let's move up to the upper ball joint. Same thing here, except this one does have a bracket that we will also have to remove once the nut's out of the way. For this one, the cotter pin's stuck in place. That's okay. We're replacing the ball joint anyway. Use a 24mm on this one. We'll give the bracket a quick inspection and we can set that aside for now. Start that one on there, just a couple threads as well. Now at this point, we're going to continue on to removing the knuckle from each one of the ball joints. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, whenever I do these, I do them as a pair because you can potentially cause damage to one or the other when you're doing the opposite. Now we can start separating this. This can be done a couple different ways. One with simply a hammer. Otherwise, you can use a hammer and a pickle fork. If you're using a pickle fork, come right in between this area, between the knuckle and the differential tube. If you're just using a hammer, just go ahead and give this area a couple loving bonks. We're going to be careful not to damage anything. Let's move along. A little bit of vibration did the trick. Hold on to that knuckle, remove each one of those nuts, and remove the knuckle from the vehicle. Let's start removing the lower ball joint. To do that, you want to make sure you have your ball joint press handy. We're going to use an adapter along the top that will go up against just the top of the ball joint, but not against this area of the differential. Now let's bring the clamp up in place. We'll put our top adapter directly onto that. Bring the lowered adapter down underneath this area. We'll get everything aligned and we can start pressing this. Double check to make sure everything's as even as possible. This can't be off kilter. We don't want to cause any damage or potentially get hurt. Now we'll start pressing this ball joint down and out. We'll cause some vibration, help break this free. There it is, friend. Now it's time for the upper ball joint. To remove this, we'll be using a cup up along the top that fits directly over the ball joint, up against that differential. Continue on with your ball joint press. To do this, we're going to bring it down and through that lower ball joint hole. Align it with the top and align it with the stud along the bottom here. Now, as we start driving this up and through, you want to be extremely careful that this does not walk off of here and potentially cause damage or hurt you. Now we can start removing the upper ball joint from the area. To get this out of here, you could have a cup up along the top that'll angle it so you don't necessarily have your tool up against the coil spring. If you don't have that specialty cup, you can continue on by lightly tapping against the bottom of this stud here, driving it up and through the top of the ball joint to remove it, or just use a cutting wheel and cut it right off. Now with the stud out of the way, we'll continue on up along the top. We can put a cup that goes directly over the ball joint, but up against the differential. Remove the boot from the area. Now at this point, we can continue on with our ball joint cup up along the top. You want to have one that fits over the ball joint, does not necessarily touch up against it, but does hit up against the differential. Take that ball joint press, we'll slide it down through the lower ball joint hole. With that in position, find a 24mm socket and put it directly up against the bottom of that ball joint. We'll take this and start applying pressure, driving it up and through. Let's make sure everything's as even as possible. Take your time on this. Remove that ball joint. Now we can install our ball joint. We'll take this with the cotter pin hole facing towards the front and the rear. Slide it down into position. Once you've done so, you're going to want to find a cup that fits over the top of this, and we'll give it a couple taps with a hammer. You want to be very careful not to damage the top of the ball joint. Try to get this as flat as possible. Now along the bottom area where the ball joint's going through the axle, you want to find a cup that fits directly over the ball joint area so it can slide down and through without causing any damage. Just give this a couple taps. Now once you've given this a couple taps, just have a quick look all the way around. You want to make sure the ball joint's completely pressed in up against that differential tube. Assuming it is, go ahead and remove your tool. Time to install the lower ball joint. Pay attention to your grease fitting. You want to make sure you have that in an area that you will be able to grease this once the wheel and everything's back on. Take an adapter that goes directly over the lip of the ball joint, not necessarily up against the boot or into the joint. You don't want to cause any damage. We'll find a cup that has the area you can press against. Now up along the top of that, you want to make sure you have a cup so the ball joint can make its way up and through without causing any damage. Let's continue pressing this into the proper position. Now as we tighten this, we'll be paying attention down along the bottom area here. You want to make sure the ball joint bottoms out completely against the differential tube. Just make sure that's straight. That should help it settle in. Remove your tool. Reinstall your knuckle. Get each one of those ball joint studs into their corresponding hole. Start on the ball joint nuts. Once you have them started on, you can snug them up, torque them to 70 foot-pounds. We'll install our bracket. It's going to slide right on here. You want to have the front facing down. Start on this mounting nut, snug it up. Careful for any pinch points. Torque that to 70 foot-pounds, as I mentioned. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the slots on the mounting nut and the hole that goes through the ball joint stud. We need to put the locking cotter pin through there. If it's not lined up, continue tightening this nut until the very next slot is. We'll pivot this once again, you can torque it. Now we'll be looking for the slot and the hole in the ball joint, align those, and we'll put in that locking cotter pin as well. Let's get that pinned over. Let's make sure this pivots without any restriction. Continue on to cleaning out this port on the knuckle so we can put in the axle, and once we've done so, we'll continue on with the bearing. Before we slide this in here, let's make sure that we clean up the splined area and down along this smooth area. That's where the differential seal will ride, so you want to make sure it's clean and free of any debris. Double check to make sure you still have your small spacer in place. Slide this through the knuckle and then into the differential tube. At this point, this should press all the way into the differential tube, and this plastic should be pretty much aligned. Let's continue on with some copper anti-seize along this side of the knuckle, and then also on the splined area of the axle. Not necessarily the threaded area though. The next thing you'll want to do is clean your mounting bolts, inspect them, apply anti-seize to the shanked area, and thread locker to the threaded area. Now it's time for the wheel bearing with that backing plate. As we put this in place, be extremely careful for your ABS wire. We'll be taking this and sliding it in place directly over the axle. Align the mounting bolt holes from the wheel bearing to the holes on the knuckle. Move this around as needed. It's important to make sure you start in all of your mounting bolts before you tighten any of them. The other side here. All right, so now that I have all of them started in, we'll snug them up and then torque each one of these 3 mounting bolts to 75 foot-pounds. Let's move along to cleaning up the mating surface on our wheel bearing hub here and the back side of the rotor. Use some parts cleaner, little wire brush. Do the same thing to the rotor real quick. All right, let's apply some copper anti-seize to the hub mating surface and we can put the rotor on here. Just use one of these lug nuts to hold the rotor in place while we continue. Let's slide this caliper back into place. Bring it right on over the rotor. Now we can start in both of our mounting bolts and torque them to 100 foot-pounds. You could use some thread locker if you want. Use our 21. Let's continue on with the ABS wire. Take that and bring it right through the center here. Now let's re-secure it to the bracket along the front. Slide it right into place. Make our way along the back side here. Now the rest of this is going to go up along the flex hose. Presses right into its mounting brackets coming across. Continue following this along the flex hose. Got one there, got another one up along the back side here. Take this and put it in position in its bracket. Now we can reconnect our ABS wire up in this area. Now when we go to reconnect this, make sure you have your locking tab aligned with this area. Once you press it in and hear a click, continue on with your red locking tab to hold everything together. There we go. Press in that red locking tab. Now it's time for the tie rod ends. We'll take this and start with the upper one. Bring it right in position. Start that nut on there. We'll snug it up and torque it to 63 foot-pounds. Let's get this aligned. If you find that the stud spins on you while you're trying to tighten the nut, use a long pry bar. Carefully make your way underneath the tie rod end up against the differential tube without causing any damage. While applying pressure in this area, we'll continue on tightening that nut. We'll torque this to 63 foot-pounds. Now that we have this one tight, let's do the same exact thing to the lower tie rod end. $63 foot-pounds here as well. Continue on to your axle nut. You'll find that I applied a thin amount of thread locker to this area. If you're reusing the nut, it's always a good idea. We'll take this and bottom it out by hand. You never want to use an air tool because we don't want to cause any damage to the bearing. You could use a ratchet if you need to. Let's bring this a little closer to the ground. To torque this nut, carefully use a pry bar. Come along your lug studs and make sure you don't cause any damage to the threaded areas. Now we can torque this to 100 foot-pounds. We're at the point where you want to double check all of your work. Ensure that you torqued everything to manufacturer's specifications. Once you've done so, go ahead and remove that safety lug nut from this area and we'll continue on by putting on the wheel. Start on all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts, bottom them out. We'll get the wheel safely back on the ground and torque each one of these to 130 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely on the ground, we'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay, friend, we've got our vehicle back together. At this point, climb inside the passenger compartment. Pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm, and take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.